I'm going to get 2 for 1 here. Are drags exploits? No.
If you're watching, Jax, I'm sorry to drag you into this, but whilst I have your attention, please can you delete this booster from ranked, as he's blatantly boosted to rank 1, and also he's Russian. The humour is now over. For the rest of this video, I'm going to address some of the few counter-arguments made against my dragging piece. If you haven't seen this already, I recommend checking it out if you're new to the discussion. The foundation of my argument rests on the fact that I'm number 1 on ranked, so what I say goes. Some people actually seem to think that's what my videos boil down to. If that were true, they'd only be 30 seconds long. The main reason I mention my rank is so detractors can't simply call me out as a noob like they would with the average player that points out how bad dragging is, but now they take the inverse approach, saying I use my position as a top player to compensate for poor arguments. If my argument is poor, why can nobody make a response video, let alone a coherent script? My actual point is that dragging is an exploit, looks janky, which turns players away from the genre, and they're not even good for the gameplay. Several people have mentioned that just because dragging was an exploit in Chivalry doesn't make it an exploit in Mordhau, because the new devs intended dragging to exist in Mordhau, therefore the mechanic is no longer an exploit. This is sophistry, and the argument is accurately depicted with the drawing on screen. The problems surrounding dragging still exist in Mordhau. Dressing up the bug with fancy language doesn't change that we're still dealing with the same bug from before. If anything, the problem has been exacerbated from Chivalry to Mordhau, with shorter parry windows and reduced emphasis on feinting thanks to chambers. I could let the drag enthusiasts have their semantic victory, as it's irrelevant to the larger debate, but I'd rather not give them an inch. The definition of an exploit in video games is the use of a bug or glitches, game system, rates, hitboxes, speed or level design, etc. by a player to their advantage in a manner not intended by the game's designers. I would argue that Mordhau and Chivalry can be considered the same game. That's not to say they're the same product, rather they share the core game design. For example, there can be 2 different chess programs that are separate pieces of software yet share identical gameplay. Mordhau and Chivalry are both the game of swing manipulation and timed blocks. There's other minor differences like chambers, but the foundation of Mordhau's gameplay is a Chivalry clone. As a result, we should still look to the designers of Chivalry when it comes to defining whether or not dragging is an exploit, especially given that dragging is more broken in Mordhau than it was in Chivalry. Here is the nail in the coffin for their argument. If dragging had been legitimised between the 2 titles, then why was there not a single showcase of it throughout the entirety of the marketing campaign? The Mordhau devs were clearly aware that it's a flaw in the game design that had been carried over from Civ 1 and did their best to cover up its existence rather than celebrate dragging as a vital part of the combat system. The next point I've seen brought up is that other genres have exploits that later get adopted, and usually this is accompanied by a multi-paragraph piece about wave dashing. Guys, I don't care about fighting games, they're a dead genre. If you're a smasher, I don't care about party games. Try using the shower exploit. Look at the Steam charts for the latest Street Fighter or Tekken. Apparently there's more players on console, which is convenient as we have no data for that claim, but the Twitch viewers don't paint a pretty picture either. I would guess that part of the reason they're dead in comparison to the behemoth that is FPS games is due to all these obtuse mechanics, exploits, tech that act as an entry barrier for new players. There may be some exploits out there that don't look ridiculous and benefits the gameplay in their respective genre, and drag enthusiasts are keen to get lost in the weeds here, but it's not relevant at all to dragging. I of course acknowledge that the genre I play is even deader than the top fighting games, but we're only a few indie games deep, and unlike the drag apologists, I'd rather not use Olympic level mental gymnastics to defend a jank exploit that's preventing us from jockeying with the big genres of esports. If we must talk about other games and their exploits, I'm more familiar with CSGO, and the comparisons made for boosting, where you jump on top of other players, are unconvincing. Firstly, boosting is visually a silly mechanic and has already been removed in Valorant, a competitor to CSGO. If map makers wanted players to get into a high up spot, just add a ladder or crates to climb. It's also caused huge controversy in the past with the infamous Olaf Pass boost that led to one team forfeiting a tournament over exploiting a previously unknown boost to completely derail the outcome of a match, so clearly the legitimacy of these verge mechanics isn't set in stone like the Exploit Acceptance Committee make out. Importantly, Accels aren't exploits, that is, outside of Chivalry 1's backswing Accels. Here's a video of a Chivalry developer demonstrating Accels in Age of Chivalry 12 years ago.
The best way to think of it is the keyboard WASD or arrow keys being your feet and legs that control your movement direction, and with the mouse representing the hips, you have the ability to turn into your strikes and ensure the blow lands flush. This feature is especially useful for landing strikes on multiple opponents or when used in combination with an evasive maneuver like a sidestep to ensure you deliver damage to the enemy and don't receive any yourself.
Whilst it can cause issues if they're too instant, the concept of accelerating a swing makes sense due to force equals mass times acceleration. When confronted with this law, drag defenders often start to nitpick other unrealistic game systems like respawning or health regen. This is a weak argument because following the same logic, you can make the case that if certain unrealistic gameplay necessities like respawning are included, then anything else goes. Why not add playable capybaras? Although this would be a great change for Mordhau, there's clearly some degree of realism that is preferable. Dragging definitely doesn't meet that criteria, as demonstrated by the thousands of negative reviews across both Civ 1 and Mordhau mentioning animation abuse or dragging specifically as their cause for complaint. The indoctrinated will tell you that the sacrifice of realism is a worthwhile trade for the supposed fun and dynamic gameplay that dragging offers when it does anything but. In the current greatsword meta of Mordhau, players are subjected to an endurance test of fake Accel drag riposte warfare with little room for counterplay. The players that were around for the launch of Chivalry, and to a certain extent Mordhau, can attest that the golden age of gameplay was before the player base discovered dragging and the fights were more grounded in appearance. If you're uncertain how the genre would even operate without dragging, which is understandable given how dominant they are in the current meta, I'd recommend watching the second Mordhau Kickstarter dev blog, where Marox breaks down 8 minutes of combat mechanics without mentioning dragging once. Only solid arguments in favour of dragging would be if someone truly enjoys the meta it promotes despite the ghastly appearance, but they'd be in the vast minority of players. Even so, they still unwittingly concede that for the genre to truly breach the mainstream, dragging must be removed or else we're doomed to stay as a dwindling curiosity played by under 2,000 concurrents. Luckily for them, Mordhau doesn't seem like it's changing anytime soon, so they can drag each other to their heart's content. The final, most bizarre argument I've heard in favour of dragging is that new players dislike drags due to poor marketing, and had the game been marketed with dragging rather than deliberately hiding their existence, new players would be more willing to accept them. This is pure fantasy. Most players at this point are aware of drags and came to the conclusion that they dislike them. Showcasing the game with drags would simply push them away from purchasing it in the first place. The implication is that there's a group of gamers out there that will be drawn to a floaty sword game and swarm in once the spotlight is shown on it. But if that's true, why aren't they playing Mordhau right now when dragging is out in the open? If you happen to reach the end of this video and you're not even sure what a drag is or how it's different from ordinary swing manipulation, then make sure to check out my more comprehensive video, Melee's Dirty Secrets.